The Battle of Adrianople, how Gothic cavalry annihilated 40,000 Roman legionaries and an emperor died on the battlefield. Before we dive into one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman history, let me ask you something. What happens when an empire that has dominated the Mediterranean world for 7 centuries, that invented professional infantry warfare, that conquered everything from Britain to Mesopotamia, sends its army against a desperate band of refugees, and loses not just the battle, but the emperor, 2/3 of the Eastern army, and its aura of invincibility? What happens when arrogance, impatience, and fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy combine to produce a slaughter so complete that it marks the beginning of Rome's terminal decline? You're about to find out. And if you think you know this story because you've heard that Rome fell to barbarians, I promise you don't know it like this. No simplistic civilization versus barbarism narrative, no noble last stand. Just the decisions, the tactics, the geography, and the brutal reality of what happened when Roman legions walked into a trap and were annihilated. If this is the kind of history you're here for, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what ancient battle I should cover next. That's all I'm asking. Now let's go back to August 9th, 378 AD, to a field outside the city of Adrianople in modern-day Turkey, where the Roman Empire would suffer a wound from which it would never fully recover. The Roman Empire in 378 AD was not the empire of Augustus or Trajan. It had been divided administratively into eastern and western halves, each with its own emperor, sharing power in theory but often competing in practice. The division was a recognition of reality. The empire was too large, too threatened on too many fronts, to be governed by a single ruler from a single capital. The Western Empire, centered on Milan and later Ravenna, faced Germanic tribes pressing across the Rhine and internal instability. The Eastern Empire, centered on Constantinople, was wealthier, more stable, and faced threats from Persia and nomadic peoples north of the Danube. In 378, the Eastern Emperor was Valens, a competent administrator and experienced general who had spent years campaigning against Persia and had stabilized the eastern frontier. He was in his late 40s, confident and hungry for a decisive military victory that would solidify his reputation. That hunger would kill him. The immediate crisis that led to Adrianople began 2 years earlier, in 376 AD, when a massive wave of Gothic refugees appeared on the northern bank of the Danube River, the empire's frontier. These were the Vingi Goths, an entire people, men, women, children, elders, perhaps 200,000 individuals fleeing westward from the Huns, a nomadic steppe confederation that had erupted out of Central Asia and was destroying everything in its path. The Goths were not invaders in the traditional sense. They were refugees asking permission to cross into Roman territory, offering to serve in the Roman army in exchange for land and protection. Rome had a long tradition of accepting barbarian groups as foederati, allied peoples who would defend the borders in exchange for settlement rights. Valens agreed, seeing an opportunity to gain thousands of warriors without the cost of recruitment and training. The resettlement was catastrophically mismanaged. Roman officials, corrupt and indifferent, saw the desperate Goths as an opportunity for profit. Food supplies promised to the refugees were diverted and sold. Goths were forced to sell their children into slavery in exchange for dog meat to survive. They were herded into camps, disarmed in theory, but many hid weapons, and treated with contempt. The Romans assumed that a disarmed, starving population could be controlled through force. They were wrong. In 377, the Goths rebelled. They armed themselves, raided Roman towns and estates, and defeated local Roman forces sent to suppress them. Within months, the Balkans were in chaos, Gothic war bands roaming freely, Roman authority collapsing. Valens was in Antioch dealing with the Persian frontier when news of the Gothic rebellion reached him. He assembled an army and marched west, arriving in Constantinople in 378. His plan was to crush the Goths decisively, restore order, and return to the east. But there was a complication. Gratian, the Western Emperor, Valens's nephew, was also marching east with reinforcements, having just won a significant victory against the Alemanni in Gaul. Gratian sent messages to Valens urging him to wait, to combine their armies, to ensure overwhelming force before engaging the Goths. It was sound, strategic advice. The two emperors together could field perhaps 60 to 80,000 men, a force the Goths could not hope to match. But waiting meant sharing the glory of victory. Valens, jealous of his nephew's recent success, impatient to prove himself, decided to attack immediately with the forces he had. It was a decision born of pride, and it would destroy him. The Roman army that marched out of Adrianople on the morning of August 9, 378 AD, numbered approximately 30 to 40,000 men. The core was the Eastern Field Army, legions that had campaigned with Valens for years, experienced soldiers, but not the elite units of previous centuries. Roman military organization had changed significantly by the 4th century. The old heavy infantry legion, the manipular formation that had conquered the Mediterranean, had evolved into a more flexible system with smaller units, increased reliance on cavalry, and more auxiliary troops. But infantry was still the backbone. The Roman infantry at Adrianople were equipped with spears, swords, large oval or round shields, and armor ranging from mail to scale to simple leather depending on unit quality. Roman cavalry, both heavy cataphracts and lighter horse archers, numbered perhaps 10 to 12,000, a significant portion of the army but still secondary to infantry in tactical doctrine. The Goths had assembled their forces around a wagon laager, a circular fortification of wagons where their non-combatants, supplies, and animals were protected. This was standard Gothic practice, mobile fortification that could be defended while warriors operated outside. The Gothic fighting force numbered perhaps 15 to 20,000 warriors, a mix of infantry and cavalry. Gothic infantry were equipped with spears, axes, swords, and shields, unarmored or lightly armored fierce fighters, but lacking the discipline and training of Roman regulars. The real strength of the Goths was their cavalry, heavy horsemen equipped with lances and long swords, capable of shock charges that could break infantry formations. But on the morning of August 9th, the Gothic cavalry was not at the wagon laager. It was foraging miles away under the command of two Gothic leaders, Alathius and Saphrax. The Gothic leader at the laager, Fritigern, knew he was vulnerable. Valens's approach to the battlefield was rushed and poorly planned. The army had marched 8 miles from Adrianople in the summer heat, carrying full equipment without adequate water supplies. By the time they reached the Gothic position around midday, the soldiers were exhausted, thirsty, and disorganized. The smart decision would have been to rest, establish a fortified camp, wait for supplies, and attack the next day. Valens did not wait. He ordered immediate deployment for battle. The Roman infantry formed up in the center, arranged in dense formations designed to push forward and break the Gothic line. The Roman cavalry deployed on the flanks, tasked with protecting the infantry from encirclement and exploiting any breakthrough. It was a conventional Roman battle plan, the kind that had won 1,000 engagements over centuries. It assumed the enemy would fight in a predictable way. Fritigern, seeing the Romans deploying, sent emissaries asking to negotiate. The sources are unclear whether this was a genuine attempt at diplomacy or a delaying tactic to buy time for the Gothic cavalry to return. Valens, pressed by his officers who wanted glory, impatient, convinced of easy victory, ignored the embassy or allowed it to drag on without substance. Hours passed. The Romans stood in formation under the August sun, baking in their armor, increasingly desperate for water. The Goths, inside their wagon circle, set fire to the dry grass and brush around the laager. Smoke blew toward the Roman lines, adding to the heat and discomfort. It was psychological warfare, making the Romans more desperate to attack and end the ordeal. In the early afternoon, the Roman attack began. The exact sequence is debated by historians, because the primary source, the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who was likely present or had access to eyewitness accounts, describes the battle in vivid but sometimes confusing detail. What is clear is that the Roman left-wing cavalry attacked prematurely before the infantry was fully engaged, possibly without orders. They charged toward the Gothic position, attempting to flank the wagon laager. The attack was poorly coordinated. Some units charged, others hesitated. The Gothic infantry inside the laager held, defended by the wagons and their own desperation. The Roman cavalry charge stalled, fell back in disorder. It was an inauspicious start. The Roman infantry then advanced against the Gothic wagon line. This was what Roman legions were trained for: close-quarters combat, shield walls grinding against each other, discipline and endurance wearing down less organized opponents. The Roman infantry pushed forward, some units reaching the wagons, fighting hand-to-hand with Gothic warriors. For a time, it looked like the Roman infantry might break through, might push into the laager and massacre the Goths trapped inside. And then the Gothic cavalry returned. Elathius and Saphrax, leading the Gothic cavalry, had been foraging miles from the laager when scouts brought word of the Roman attack. They rode back at full speed, thousands of horsemen thundering across the plain. They arrived at the battlefield at the critical moment when the Roman infantry was committed, pressed against the Gothic wagon line, flanks exposed. The Gothic cavalry did not hesitate. They charged directly into the Roman right flank, smashing into the Roman cavalry that was supposed to protect the infantry. The Roman cavalry, already disorganized from the earlier failed charge, buckled. Some units fought, others broke and fled. The Gothic horsemen drove through, wheeling around to hit the Roman infantry from the side and rear. The Roman infantry, already exhausted, thirsty, now found themselves attacked from multiple directions. The Gothic infantry inside the laager, seeing the cavalry arrive, surged forward, counterattacking with renewed energy. The Roman formations compressed, units pushed together into a tighter and tighter space as the Goths pressed from all sides. This is where the Roman tactical advantage disintegrated. Roman infantry doctrine relied on flexibility, units maneuvering to support each other, maintaining formation. Compressed into a dense mass, they couldn't maneuver. Soldiers couldn't use their weapons effectively. Men were trampled, crushed, suffocated. The Goths, attacking from the perimeter, had room to swing their weapons, to throw javelins, to ride down fleeing soldiers. It became a massacre. Ammianus Marcellinus describes the scene in horrifying detail. Roman soldiers so tightly packed they couldn't raise their arms to defend themselves. Men trampled underfoot by their own comrades, officers trying to rally their units and being cut down. The standards, the sacred eagles of the legions, surrounded and defended to the death by their bearers. The slaughter went on for hours. By late afternoon, the Roman army had disintegrated. Those who could flee did. Those who couldn't were killed or captured. Entire units ceased to exist. Two-thirds of the Eastern Roman army was destroyed, approximately 25,000 to 30,000 men dead, wounded, or captured. Emperor Valens was somewhere in that chaos. The exact circumstances of his death are unknown because no one who saw it survived or left a reliable account. The most likely version is that Valens, wounded during the battle, was carried by his guards to a nearby farmhouse. Gothic warriors surrounded the building, not knowing the emperor was inside. They set it on fire. Valens and his guards burned to death. Another version says he was killed on the battlefield and his body was never identified, lost among the thousands of corpses. A third version, likely propaganda, claims he died fighting heroically. What matters is that the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire was dead, killed by the enemy, his body unrecovered. For Rome, it was a humiliation beyond measure. Emperors did not die in battle. The last emperor to die fighting the enemy had been Decius in 251 AD, over a century earlier. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The survivors of the Roman army fled south to Adrianople, pursued by Gothic cavalry. The gates of the city were closed to prevent a Gothic breakthrough. Thousands of wounded and fleeing soldiers were left outside to be slaughtered or captured. The city itself was besieged briefly, but the Goths lacked siege equipment and experience in taking fortified cities. They withdrew, spreading across the Balkans, looting, raiding, destroying Roman estates and towns. There was no Roman field army left to stop them. News of the disaster reached Gratian, the Western emperor, who had been marching east to reinforce Valens. Gratian halted, realizing he could not face the Goths alone. He appointed a new Eastern emperor, Theodosius, a Spanish general with a solid military reputation. Theodosius spent the next 4 years rebuilding the Eastern army, recruiting heavily from Gothic and other barbarian groups, essentially creating a Roman army that was increasingly composed of the same peoples Rome was supposed to be defending against. He eventually negotiated a settlement with the Goths in 382, granting them land within the empire and allowing them to retain their own leadership and military structure in exchange for military service. It was a pragmatic solution, but it set a precedent. Barbarian groups could now settle inside the empire, retain their identity, and demand concessions through the threat of force. The casualties at Adrianople are estimated at 25,000 to 30,000 Roman soldiers killed, perhaps 2/3 of the army. The Goths suffered significant casualties as well, though sources do not provide reliable numbers, likely several thousand dead and wounded. But the Goths won, decisively, completely, and the psychological impact was far greater than the numbers. Rome had lost entire legions before, in disasters like Cannae against Hannibal, the Teutoburg Forest against Germanic tribes, Carrhae against the Parthians. But Rome had always recovered, rebuilt the legions, learned from mistakes, and come back stronger. After Adrianople, that pattern broke. The Roman military never fully recovered its strength in the West. Why did Adrianople happen? How did an empire with centuries of military experience, professional soldiers, superior logistics, and tactical doctrine lose so catastrophically to a barbarian warband? Start with leadership. Valens made a series of fatal errors. He rushed into battle without waiting for reinforcements, driven by jealousy and impatience. He marched his army 8 miles in summer heat without adequate water, ensuring they were exhausted before the battle began. He ignored intelligence about the Gothic cavalry being away from the Lager, either not knowing it would return or not caring. And he allowed his army to stand in formation for hours in the heat, further degrading their combat effectiveness. Every decision was wrong, then tactics. The Roman battle plan assumed a conventional infantry engagement where Roman discipline and training would grind down less organized opponents. It did not account for the possibility of a massive cavalry force arriving at the decisive moment and hitting the flanks. The Roman cavalry, which should have protected the infantry from such an attack, was poorly coordinated and failed to screen effectively. When the Gothic cavalry arrived, the Roman response was reactive, defensive, and ultimately ineffective. The Romans were outmaneuvered. Logistics matter. The Roman army had no water. Soldiers fighting in armor in summer heat without water are not soldiers, they are liabilities. Dehydration causes confusion, weakness, inability to maintain formation or fight effectively. The Goths, defending a stationary position, had access to supplies from their wagon lager. The tactical advantage was with the defenders, geography and timing. The Goths had chosen their position carefully, a relatively open plain where cavalry could operate, but with the wagon lager providing a fortified core that infantry had to attack. Fritigern's delay tactics, whether deliberate or opportunistic, kept the Roman army standing in the heat for hours while the Gothic cavalry rode back to the battlefield. The timing of the Gothic cavalry's arrival was perfect, hitting the Romans when they were committed and vulnerable. Finally, the fundamental shift in military balance that Adrianople represented. For centuries, Roman heavy infantry had dominated Mediterranean warfare. Cavalry was important, but secondary. Adrianople showed that massed heavy cavalry, properly deployed, could destroy even the best infantry. The Gothic cavalry charge shattered Roman formations, and turn the battle into a rout. This was a preview of medieval warfare, where cavalry would be the dominant arm and infantry would be relegated to support roles for centuries until the pike and gunpowder shifted the balance again. The long-term consequences of Adrianople were profound and cascading. Militarily, the Eastern Roman army was shattered and had to be rebuilt using increasingly barbarian recruits and officers. By the early 5th century, the Roman army in the West was barely Roman in composition, mostly Germanic foederati fighting under their own leaders for Roman pay and titles. This created a military dependency that Rome could not escape. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the late 5th century, it was not conquered by external invasion, but imploded when barbarian generals decided they no longer needed puppet emperors and just took power themselves. Politically, Adrianople destroyed the prestige of the Roman military. For centuries, Rome's enemies had believed that Rome would eventually win, that Roman discipline and resources were inexhaustible, that defying Rome meant eventual destruction. Adrianople showed that Rome could be beaten decisively, that Roman emperors were mortal, that Roman armies could be annihilated. Every barbarian group on the frontier took note. The Vandals, the Visigoths, the Burgundians, the Franks, all would push harder, demand more, knowing that Rome could be forced to the negotiating table or defeated outright. Demographically and economically, the settlement of Gothic and other barbarian groups inside the empire accelerated the transformation of Roman society. These groups retained their languages, their laws, their leadership structures. They paid fewer taxes, provided military service on their own terms, and increasingly saw themselves as autonomous entities within a weakening imperial framework. By the mid-5th century, the Western Empire was a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms nominally loyal to Rome, but effectively independent. The Eastern Empire, which became the Byzantine Empire, survived another 1,000 years, but it too was transformed, increasingly reliant on barbarian and later Slavic and Turkic military forces. Culturally, Adrianople marked a shift in how Romans saw themselves. The confident, expansionist empire of the Principate was gone. The 4th and 5th centuries were an age of anxiety, of apocalyptic thinking, of conversion to Christianity, in part because the old gods seemed to have abandoned Rome. When Rome was sacked by the Visigoths in 410 AD, a generation after Adrianople, it was the first time the city had fallen to foreign enemies in 800 years. The shock was seismic. Augustine of Hippo wrote The City of God in response, arguing that earthly empires were transient and Christians should focus on the heavenly kingdom. It was a theological response to political collapse. And here's the final irony. The Goths who won at Adrianople did not destroy Rome. Many of them eventually became foederati, serving in the Roman army, defending the empire against other barbarian groups. The Visigoths, descendants of the Vingi who fought at Adrianople, would sack Rome in 410, but then settle in southern Gaul and Spain as nominal Roman allies. The Ostrogoths would conquer Italy in the late 5th century and attempt to restore Roman governance under barbarian leadership. The Gothic kingdoms saw themselves as successors to Rome, not destroyers. They wanted to be Roman, to claim the prestige and legitimacy of Roman civilization. But Adrianople was the moment when the balance shifted, when barbarians stopped being supplicants asking permission to enter the empire and became military powers that Rome had to negotiate with as equals. But on August 9, 378 AD, on that field outside Adrianople, as the sun set on the corpses of 25,000 Roman soldiers, as Gothic cavalry hunted down fleeing survivors, as the Emperor of Rome burned to death in a farmhouse or lay unidentified among the dead, none of the long-term consequences mattered. What mattered was that Rome had lost, catastrophically. Completely, an empire that had thought itself invincible, that had built its identity on military dominance, had been destroyed by desperate refugees it had abused and underestimated. One battle, one afternoon, one arrogant emperor's decision to attack without waiting for reinforcements, and the trajectory of European history changed. That's the story of Adrianople. No clean narratives, no barbarian hordes destroying civilization, just bad decisions, tactical failures, and the brutal reality that empires are not immortal. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a video. Share this with anyone who thinks Rome fell because of moral decay or Christianity or whatever oversimplified explanation is popular. Drop a comment telling me what you thought, what I missed, what ancient battle you want me to cover next. This is history without the filter, and we're just getting started.